Hello. So in this video, our main focus is going to be on trying to create an illusion of depth and distance using details. So when you think about the element of art, it is space, and creating space in an artwork, one way we can do that is through thinking about the amount of details we have in objects that are in our background, middle ground, foreground. Okay, so when we divide this kind of picture plane up, we've got a background which will include all the things farthest away from you. Your foreground will include all the things closest to you, which is typically located near the bottom of the page. And then the middle ground is kind of in between the background and the foreground. So if we take a look at this artwork right here, this is a watercolor painting by Gerald F. Brommer, and it's called Taxco Landmark. One thing that you'll notice is all of our objects that are way back here in the background and the furthest away have the least amount of details. Okay, so they're very vague, kind of main shapes. You can't really see a lot of details like the windows and kind of changes in lights and things like that. And then as we gradually progress closer to the viewer and we move here to the middle ground, you start to see slightly more differences between like light and dark areas. You can start to see some of like the individual windows. And then as we progress further up to the foreground, we can see many more details. Okay, so when we think about how we want to do that in an artwork, overall, that helps us create an illusion of depth and distance, an illusion of space. So what I would like for you to do is make sure you have taken a look at your instruction sheet before we begin and assemble all of your required materials. You are going to want like a scrap paper or folder to tape your paper to. You're going to want a 4x6 sheet of watercolor paper. Make sure you have a roll of the thicker, like white 1/2-inch masking tape. You are going to want your paints. Okay, so gather your paints, a water cup, your paint brushes, and you are also going to want a towel to blot your paintbrush out on. So in order to save a little bit of time on the video, I went ahead and taped my paper down. If you want to create a painting that is more horizontally formatted, tape your painting so it's wider than it is tall. I've decided for this particular artwork, I want my particular painting to be taller. Okay, so I've tried to create an even border with taping this down. And then I also created an all over really light, even wash. This is going to represent like the sky in my painting. So now I'm ready to begin. Okay, so what I would recommend that you do at this point is maybe pause the video, go ahead and get everything taped down, go ahead and tape your wash, and then do a quick dry with a blow dryer and dry your painting. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do now is I am going to create a sense of ground in space. Okay, so I'm going to mix up a little bit of like a green that I want to use, and I'm going to just create like some blue-green kind of hills out here, and then I'm going to start to fill all of this space as I progress down to the bottom. And I'm going to change my color. And fill that all the way down from top to bottom. Okay, so at this point, because I want to create illusions with details and I do want to be able to actually see some details in my painting, I am going to stop and pause this, and I am going to dry my painting, and then I'm going to start to focus on painting my shapes in the background, middle ground, and foreground. Okay, so at this point in the painting, I went ahead and dried. I've got a sky, I've got a ground. I'm going to do, some kind of landscape or realistic scene, at this point you want to think about your subject. What is it that you want to paint? And you want to make sure that you choose a subject that does have some details in it. So in the poster that I showed you at the beginning with that example painting, that artist had a lot of buildings. So as you're choosing, I would not pick something like super simple that doesn't have a lot of details to begin with, because you want to choose something that you can gradually have less details as you work your way back. So I have decided that I'm just going to paint some trees and maybe like grass and scenery in here as we go. So these are just like a couple examples that I've got from a previous little project that I've done. So I think I'll probably do like some evergreen trees back here. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I've got kind of my ground established, and I'm just going to go ahead and paint some little tree trunks. And I'm going to make sure that I establish and paint these kind of in all three layers of space. So I want to make sure that I've got a background, middle ground, foreground. And so what I'm going to do at this point now is I'm just going to make sure that I'm using my exact same color for all three of these. And now I'm going to just kind of paint that shape in. Okay, so I know that with these trees, they're gradually a little bit taller at the top, or shorter at the top as they get tall, and then they usually get a little bit wider at the bottom. So I'm just going to kind of paint those details in as I go. And I'm going to do this for all three layers of space, and I'm going to paint all of these to look identical to begin with. Okay, so in order to make sure that I'm adding less details with each layer, I think it's good to go ahead and paint the exact same identical thing in each layer. And then when we paint with watercolor paints, one thing that is really good to kind of focus on is building up, layers. Okay, so as things get more detailed or more realistic, we've got, let's make that one a little taller, more layers. So I'm gradually, as I get more detailed, you can see more variation in color and that sort of thing. Another thing that I think that I will do is maybe I want to create slightly different color here. Add a little bit more yellow and green so it doesn't look quite so blue. And maybe around this, I might start to kind of stipple around in this space a little bit of texture for like my grass and my greenery. So whatever it is that you choose to do and paint, make sure that you are filling all of the space from background to middle ground to foreground. Create all three layers, and then make sure you have like a very vague shapes and layers in the background. Okay, so I'm going to keep all this simple, and then I've kind of added like a little bit of texture as I get a little bit closer. And so what I'm going to do at this point is we need to stop. We need this to be dry before we can move on. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to go dry my painting, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to start to add a few more layers and details into my middle ground and foreground. So this painting looks like it gradually gets more detailed as you get closer to the viewer. Okay, so one way to create an illusion of more details is to build up several layers. Okay, so I kind of talked about that previously. I've got kind of this background layer back here, and then I created just like a stippling effect to kind of maybe create like the texture of like the grass and ground around that. So I'm going to take that exact same color that I just used, and I'm going to go ahead and stipple again some of this space kind of up here, I'm going to go like right below, kind of where I had the bottom of those trunks of those trees that I painted in the background. And then I'm also going to stipple all the way around these trees to create the grass in the ground for everything in the middle ground all the way down to the foreground. So one thing that's starting to happen is I'm starting to lose some of the details of my trees. I'm afraid if I go ahead and focus on those a little bit more, that's going to start to blend and mix and bleed into what I've just done. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to quickly dry all that little stippling and texture that I added in. And then I'm going to show you how to focus on the trees and make a few more details with those. So I just dried all of the little areas of that grass that I stippled in. And now what I'm going to do is we want to darken up some of the details that you can see in the middle ground and the foreground. Okay, so we want our background to be kind of vague. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to use, for the most part, the same or similar color that I've done before. And I'm just going to kind of go back over that little tree trunk again that I had before. And we've got some of those kind of lighter areas, but now I'm going to kind of darken so that with details, especially with some of these, you're going to be able to see a little bit more variation in the texture. So in order to see that variation, we're going to want to be able to see a whole lot more like light values and dark values. So that vague color and shape that we did before is going to mainly be our lightest values. Okay, so I'm going to come in now and kind of paint and stipple in some of the darker values and shadows, but I don't want to completely fill all of those light spaces, because in order to see some of those, I do want to be able to see more light, medium, and dark, and definitely more texture with that. So as we get closer to our foreground, we should definitely be able to pick out a lot more individual layers of texture and details. So it's time to pause again and dry, and I'll show you how to finish up and create even more details in your foreground. Okay, so time to finish this painting up. So as a reminder to you, you do not have to paint exactly what I paint for these. You don't have to create a painting that's got a lot of trees. Whatever it is that you choose to paint, do make sure that you're being really thoughtful and thinking about, what can I paint 3 times in at least 3 different layers of space, and how can I make that gradually much more detailed as I move from the background to the foreground. So I like landscapes for this particular thing. I think they work really well with watercolor paints, mainly because landscapes have a lot of different textures. So when you are painting with textures, you can make things a lot more clear where we see the textures, and a lot more vague and kind of blurred and mixed together. So as I get kind of up here closer, it may be possible that I can start to see, rather than just kind of like a stippled shape, maybe in between you can start to see more like longer lines, like individual blades of grass. Maybe you can see things like, I don't know, flowers, or items like that. So I came in with some yellow, and then because this is like a green. I know yellow is going to blend and mix in. So as I start to kind of add some of my textures to these trees in the foreground, I do know that that yellow is going to kind of mix and blend in with the green as it dries. And I know that green sometimes is going to have like a yellow color or look to it as the light hits it. It might pull out more yellow greens. Okay, and so I'm working with a very small brush, because with a small brush I can definitely do a lot more details with this. And because I do want the colors to kind of mix and blend a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and not necessarily pause and dry, but I'm going to go ahead and kind of paint over that. Okay, so really what I'm doing here is simply just painting a lot of really thin lines kind of up and down, and then I'm using more like a yellow green. And with this, I can maybe see a little bit of variation. So I've got kind of that darker color. Remember, when we like paint over something, it's going to start to kind of lift that away. Okay. And then I'm going to start to focus on, more of like the details. Maybe the trees are going to look a lot more fuller. Maybe I'm going to be able to see a lot more lighter and darker values. Okay, so I'm kind of painting over, and I know it's going to start to look a little bit more vague. But as you layer your watercolors, right, and as they start to dry, some of those colors that we painted underneath, they are going to start to show through in the layers that we add above. So with texture, one of the biggest ways to make sure you see more details is we definitely want to focus on areas where you see much darker shadows and much lighter like highlights and textures. So as I drop that color in, I do think to do this final layer of details, we want to dry this one more time, because as we paint details, we do want to make sure that we can see like the crisp clear lines. And you're going to need to paint like a wet on dry to see that. So I'm going to pause again, and then I'm going to finish up the details in this closest layer space. All right, this is it. This is time for finishing touches. Some things that I think about as I pause and come back to this, and some things I want to make sure that you all are thinking about as you paint. Do not simply just make your colors get darker. The key to detail is seeing like variation in these colors. So I can see like much lighter areas, much darker areas, and then kind of the contrast in between. So you will see, maybe some of the shadows where not as much light is kind of getting into like the interior of your tree. So think about that. Like if you're painting like a house, you're going to be able to see details like, the texture of the siding, or some of the trim around the windows. Okay. And so, if you're doing a person, maybe you can see the individual, I don't know, like texture of their hair, or, some of the details on like the clothing that they're wearing. Okay, so do really try to think, from that standpoint as you paint, how can you, make something more detailed as we work. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop the video, because I think you all kind of get the gist of what you're trying to do, I'm going to add just a few more colors and details up here to some of my painting, and then hopefully you'll be able to see kind of the difference between less detailed, slightly more detailed, whole lot of details here in the front. So that's how you create the illusion of depth and distance with details.